Hi, my name is Alyssa, and I draw a lot of stuff including Animal Crossing characters. So this week's video is actually kind of a request. A couple weeks back in one of the videos somebody left a comment asking if they could see a real-time drawing tutorial video about these villagers instead of the more sped-up tutorial I uploaded a while back. So I thought it would be fun to draw Tom Nook in his cute little Hawaiian shirt with the New Horizons leaf pattern on it. So this is going to be a real-time drawing video. I'll pop in intermittently to talk about the things that I'm doing, but a lot of this will just be music playing and a more relaxing, long video to put on in the background while you work or draw or do whatever you do. So here I'm just working out the sketch of Tom Nook and about how big he'll be on the canvas, and I'm also using the colors up at the top. I think this is the color palette I'm going to be using for all of the New Horizons villagers that'll be coming out with the game, and I'll also be doing art of Isabelle in her island shirt and the dodo birds and all the island special characters as well, so that'll be fun to use this really bright tropical color palette for them. I wasn't as happy with the first sketch, so I went and did another sketch. I did want to keep it real time though, so for your sake I'll show you that yes, I do mess up and restart the sketches quite often actually, so here I am doing a second sketch, and this is the one I end up going with for the final artwork. I'm finally adding in his face. I'm trying to fix my old bad habits of drawing the eyes and the face first, because in reality you should be drawing the whole body and then working your way toward the more detailed stuff at the tail end. So I'm pretty happy with how his little face turned out here. I think he looks more or less on model, but just different enough that I think he has like a little touch of my own style as well. So now that I'm kind of happy with where the sketch is going, though I do adjust it many more times after this, as you'll see, I'm adding in some finer details like the leaf pattern that's on his little Hawaiian shirt, that New Horizons leaf pattern that repeats all over his shirt. and I continue to mess with the proportions of his head and his tail and getting everything just the way I like it at the tail end. Obviously this wouldn't be something that's as easy to do. Traditionally you'd have to do a lot of erasing and whatever, but with the magic of digital art I don't have to worry about those kinds of things, so I kind of adjust the proportions of everything until I'm happy with it. And I'm just about finished with the sketch phase here. I think this phase takes longer than doing the coloring and the final touch-ups, so it's important to get this just right. And here I'm adjusting the head again, and I think I adjust the tail one more time just to make sure everything looks just the way I want it to before I head into the next phase, which is the flat coloring. Next phase, I put another layer underneath the sketch layer, and at this point I'll go into my color palette up top and it'll help me figure out the colors that I want to put in the final artwork. And here it doesn't really matter if it's clean or messy or not. I'm making it a little bit cleaner so you can kind of get an idea of where all the colors go for this tutorial, but usually this part goes super fast. I just really rapidly lay down color. If you've seen any of my A to Z sketch videos, you see how messy some of the colors are sometimes because it really doesn't matter. I'm just using it as a guide for the next part. Here I'm just figuring out what shades of brown to use for the eye mask and all this kind of thing. And I make sure to only use the colors that are in the color palette, or I can mix the colors of the color palette together. I'm going to really try to adhere to this color palette for the New Horizons villagers because I do break the color palettes quite a bit for my A to Z series, because there's some villagers where they're bright blue but there's no blue in their color palette and it looks just way too wrong to put them in purple, which would be fine, except I want them to be recognizable to the people that love those characters. So for New Horizons, I think I'm going to stick to this very islandy color palette because I think even if the colors are wrong, at least there's one shade of every color in the rainbow here, and it'll kind of keep everything that muted islandy, color feel to it, for lack of a better word. And this part of the process usually only takes a minute or two. I think for this tutorial I wanted to make it a little more clean and easy to understand, but generally I'll just lay down whatever color in a big blob brush or whatever. So this part is even longer than it normally is, but hopefully it gives you an idea of how I'm sampling these colors and where I'm placing them in terms of layers and all that kind of thing. At this point, I'm nearly done with placing the colors down, so at this point I would export the image as a PNG. I use AirDrop because I have a MacBook, but you can email it to yourself or send it to Dropbox or any other way you export files. I'll export it as a PNG file. It doesn't really matter the file format. You could do JPEG or whatever. Send it to myself, and then I open up Adobe Animate and paste this image in Adobe Animate in a canvas about 1000 pixels by 1000 pixels. I tend to use a bigger canvas, that way when I export it at say 400 dpi, it'll be a really huge file, because it's always better to scale down a big file than it is to stretch out a small one. That way you avoid pixelation issues. Now this part is the Adobe Animate part, and this part is optional. I do it this way because I've been using Adobe Animate for years to make vector art, because I never really learned how to use Illustrator, and this is just my kind of roundabout, unorthodox way of making vector art. Vector art, if you don't know, there's raster and vector art. So PNG files, JPEG files, bitmap files, things like that are raster based, which means they're only as big as you create them, and if you scale them up they get all pixelated and lose quality. Whereas a vector image is determined mathematically, so you could scale it up as big as a billboard and it wouldn't lose any quality. So for a lot of commission work I do, people really want that vector file because they want to be able to scale up their mascot or their logo infinitely without losing any quality. So long story short, I know how to use Adobe Animate for that kind of thing, so I use it here. But all I'm trying to do here is make very simple shapes, eyedroppering those colors that I placed in my kind of guide, as you see. So the actual process of what I'm doing in Animate is I'm taking the pencil tool, which is just my outline. I'm outlining the simple shapes here, like the eye mask you're seeing, the ears, whatever. I'm kind of walling them off and making sure they're all closed shapes, and then I'm filling those closed shapes with, I'm eyedropping the colors from the guide underneath to make solid shapes. And why I like doing this is because it's quick for me, because I know how to use this program, so it's kind of second nature, but I like the really clean, hard edges I get by doing this as opposed to freehand drawing it. Now, if you want to avoid all this mess or don't have Adobe Animate or don't like vector or whatever, that's totally fine. A normal person would not do this. This is just how I do it. How you could do this in Procreate or your digital art program of choice is you could just make a layer and maybe use the pen tool in Photoshop to create solid shapes that are filled with these colors if you want that clean, hard edge. Or you could also freehand draw it and get a nice messy edge that could also look really nice too. If you use a smoothing tool to get smoother edges or something like that. It's really up to you. This is just how I like to do it because I really like those really harsh, clean edges that these vector shapes give me, and using this program is like second nature to me for this kind of thing. It's funny that I use Adobe Animate a lot, but I don't animate a lot. I should change that in the future, but for now I just use it to create vector art and really smooth, clean shapes like this. I like to use the pencil tool, but sometimes I use the line tool to create a really harsh edge and then just bend that using the arrow tool. But the pencil tool I like with my iPad as my tablet. I use Astropad to mirror my screen, so it basically functions as a little Wacom Cintiq where you can actually see what you're doing on the iPad screen. And I'll use the pencil tool because it's freehand, so it gives me the freedom of that hand-drawn line, but also that nice crisp hard edge, so it's like the best of both worlds for me. And I'm just separating the basic shapes, so things like the leaves here, I'm going to be drawing that on a new layer in Procreate, so I'm not really worried about that kind of stuff. All I'm worried about is the detail, or the non-detailed areas rather, like the solid patch of that off-white that makes the shirt, the solid chunk of brown that makes up his face. Shapes like that is what I'm really doing here at this point. And most of the time when I'm doing my villager art in my A to Z series, I don't wall off or make a shape for the pupil. I like to hand draw that in because I kind of like that fuzzy pencil edge on the pupil. Though for Tom Nook I did it a little differently, so I did actually make his blue pupil a distinct shape because I liked it to look clean for this one. It kind of just depends on how I'm feeling, what areas I want to do more pencil-y hand drawn and what areas I want to do really bold and crisp like this. But generally most of the basic shapes are done like this, and then I just add fine details on top. It's really easy to do this part because once I have the colors picked out, it's kind of just a matter of tracing and using the fill bucket tool, so this part goes actually pretty quick in the process. And this part, even though it is real time, I'm doing it a little bit slower to kind of show the process to people who maybe want to try doing it this way for whatever reason in a vector-based program, or just are curious of how I do it in real time. Though usually I'll sit down and do like, so you know, I post 9 a week on Instagram, so I'll open up 9 different files and do 9 of these in a row. So I really get into a groove, and I can actually do this part quite a bit faster than I'm doing it in this video. So I think this section in this video is, what, 5 minutes, but I can usually do one in about 3 minutes or something like that, so I can really, you know, get it to an assembly line process and really make a lot of them at once. This couple Sundays ago, I did an entire month's worth of this flat color, so I have like 40 or so, 36 villagers, 4 weeks times 9. So I have like 36 villagers I sat and I did in an afternoon on Sunday just doing this part of the process, just assembly lining that part out, and that makes the next phase in Procreate so much easier and faster when I get to that later. So here I'm just finishing up adding all the shapes and then going with the fill bucket and filling them in. I'll just let the rest of the process play out and you can watch and relax. So now that I'm just about done with this part of the process, what I do when I'm done with this part, the simple shape part, I export this as a PNG file and I save it to Dropbox rather than airdropping it over to my iPad. I do this because if I airdrop the file right to my iPad, it doesn't maintain the transparency. Even though it's a PNG file, it saves it with a white background, and I need that transparency in Procreate so that my square background will show through. So how to maintain that transparency is I will save this image to Dropbox and then I'll import from Dropbox in Procreate, and that keeps that PNG transparency. So highly recommend, if you're going to be working in a separate program and importing PNGs, to have a Dropbox account and link that up to your Procreate. That way you can keep that nice transparent background, which is the best thing about PNG files. So this part for this video is the longest part of the process, which is funny because for some villagers the sketch process actually takes quite a bit longer. But for Tom Nook, I was trying out a few different things with the gradient background and some other little fine detail work, and putting a little extra TLC into him because I wanted him to be the template for how I do the New Horizons villagers. So in short, this is the longest part of the video, and you're going to be kicking back and listening to music for quite a bit of this process. Anyhow, what I'm doing here is I'm importing that PNG from Dropbox of Tom Nook, bringing it into the canvas, and I'm putting him underneath the sketch layer. And usually I'll set the opacity to like 50% on the sketch layer so I can still see it, and I position everything where I want it to be for the final picture. I like him sticking out of the box just a little bit, not too much. Once I have my sketch layer at like 50% opacity, I'll make a new layer on top, and on this layer I usually pick a 6B pencil brush. I think that's the brush I go to for everything. It's a default brush in Procreate, but if you're using Photoshop you can use whatever brush you like. I like to use something with a little bit of texture like a pencil brush because I think it adds a little dimension to the picture instead of it being entirely flat, but you could make it entirely flat if that's your style too. So anyhow, this is where I'm adding all the fine details that I didn't add in the previous flat color phase, so the leaves on the shirt and, you know, things like that. Little lines on the paws to show the toes, and sometimes I'll add like a line for a crease in the pants if it's not clear enough from the shading, things like that. So kick back and relax. This segment will be a lot of listening to music and just watching me do the details on top, and I'll pop back in when I'm doing something more interesting later in the video. So now that I'm finally done with the leaves on the shirt, I really wanted to make sure those looked good, so I spent a little bit more time on them than I remember doing now that I'm watching this video back. But yeah, here I am adding in other details to Tom Nook, such as the little eyelids on his eye and, you know, things that I didn't add that add another layer of personality and detail I like to add with the pencil brush on top. I was trying to do something to define the nose. I was adding this dark line on top, and then I decided I didn't really like that, so I ended up taking it off. But I kind of play with, I try to minimize the amount of lines I put on this layer as much as possible because I like that it's mostly simple shapes with shading. I don't want to add too many lines or whatever, so I try to eliminate as many lines as possible if I don't think they're needed, so I got rid of that. But I did want to try something. I don't normally do this kind of stuff in my villagers. I like to keep those sharp edges, but I wanted to kind of fade that nose into the rest of the fur a little bit. So I take a Bonobo chalk brush, another default Procreate brush, but you could use any chalk brush in Photoshop for the same effect. And I'm just going in on that imported layer, the color layer, and I'm just painting directly on it to blend it together. And why I do this all on one layer is because later when I'm doing the shading, which you guys will see in a bit, I like to duplicate this entire color layer and then make it darker and less saturated and all that to get the shadows. And if I do any of these special effects on a new layer, I would also have to duplicate that layer and do the same thing. In short, it just makes it easier. If you're going to edit the flat colors of the picture, just do it all on the same layer and commit to it. It makes your life so much easier later when you're doing the shadows and highlights and stuff like that, so that's why I mess around with it on that layer. If I made any really grave mistakes, in theory, I could just re-import the PNG from Dropbox and start over, but there's not really a whole lot to mess up here. I just kind of faded that snout dark fur into that more light fur just to soften it up a little bit, so didn't mess it up. So here, notice where the leaf line overlaps where the button is there. On a real patterned shirt, that fabric would be a little bit misaligned, so I'm just selecting that with the lasso tool, or whatever they call it in Procreate. It's the lasso tool, select tool, and I just shifted it up a little bit to make it look more like what a real patterned t-shirt, button-up t-shirt would look like, how the fabric gets a little bit askew in that area, because it's the same pattern, just not aligned properly, so just a little detail I wanted to add to the shirt to make it a little bit more believable, even though it's highly simplified and cartoony, you know? Those little touches make a difference. Since I also liked that soft effect on the nose, I replicated it more subtly here by the ears. It's really hard to notice unless you're zoomed in, but I went into that color layer and I also fuzzed out the edges a little bit with that Bonobo chalk brush just to, I don't know, add a little something something. I actually did it on a layer on top and then erased and then merged that layer down. So that's another way to mess with stuff without committing, is you can do it on a new layer, but then once you're happy with it, you can merge it down and kind of, you know, lock it in. But definitely making it all one layer will help you when we get to the shadow part, and I'll explain that more later. And here I'm done with the flat colors, so what I'm doing is I'm duplicating that color layer, and this is why it's important to have it all on one layer. I'm going into adjusting the color balance or the saturation, brightness, darkness, things like that. My formula is I'll just make it less saturated, a little bit darker, a little bit more purpley, and sometimes I'll go into color balance and make it a little more blue, purple, whatever, until I get a nice purpley, shadowy tone to the whole layer. And I'm messing with the background here as well. I'm taking one of my favorite brushes, another Procreate default is Nico Rule. I think it's under painting. And I'm just painting with a couple shades of that teal because for the island characters I want to get more gradients and more interesting colors in the background instead of just solid color like I've been doing for the regular A to Z series. I really like that effect in the Sanrio villagers, so I thought it would be fun to mess with those gradients again with the New Horizons villagers and special characters. So anyhow, back to the shading. And yeah, I'm going in on the shadow layer and making it more purpley, more blue, less saturated, trying to get a nice shadow color that I'm happy with. You can just play with it, you can make it a green shadow, red shadow, whatever, as long as it makes sense with what kind of lighting you're going for. I tend to like purpley and bluey shadows. So once I'm happy with the shadow layer, I select it and then I select mask. And what that does is it allows you to erase the layer or add the layer back in using black and white brushes. It can be any brush, but you can also fix it if you mess up. So it's a non-destructive layer edit. What that means is if you mess up, you can fix it really easy. So in short, if you take black, it erases the layer, and if you take white, it brings it back. So I have the shadow layer activated and I set my paintbrush to Bonobo chalk because I like that chalky texture, and I make it black and I start painting in the light because some people like to paint their shadows on top. For me, it makes more sense if I have a shadow layer and then I'm painting where the light would hit that character. It's just something that I've always done, or I've done for the longest time I can remember, and it really helps me imagine the lighting scenario a little better than if I was adding shadows to something that was already eliminated. But you can do it however you're comfortable with. You can add this as a shadow layer, but I would highly recommend doing something like masking it or making it a non-destructive layer. That way you can always fix it and tweak it later without having to like repaint anything, you know? I continue to, I think I adjust the shadow layer again to make it darker because I wasn't happy with how dark it is, but that's the joy of digital art, is you can always just change the tone of that later on. So yeah, I'm just going in and I'm painting the light where I think it would hit on Tom Nook, his tummy and his face and all those kinds of things. And I tend to do it with a big brush at first, and then I'll go in with a smaller brush with white and paint that shadow back in if I need it to be a little bit more crisp, like underneath his head or whatever, where I want the shadow to be a little harsher or have a harsher, cleaner edge on it. You can always paint back in with the white, but I like to do a nice big soft black brush first, which takes away a lot of that shadow and gives you like a nice soft lighting effect, you know? It looks like a nice soft daylight instead of like a really harsh like a studio spotlight or a stage light or something like that. Here, sometimes what I like to do is I like to make the shadows define the edges of things, but I feel like the sleeve here on the left, our left, or Tom Nook's right arm, I feel like it's not quite defined enough, so I'll go in with a pencil brush on that detail layer and I'll just add a little line to define it. I try not to do this too much. Again, I'm trying to limit how many lines I use so it still looks and feels like a lineless character overall, but sometimes some areas just need a little extra definition and that's okay. So that definitely looks a lot better than it did. I do also add lines in for the lapels of the shirt, but I do that near like the tail end of the process because for a while I think, oh, it still looks good with just the shadows, but after a while I realize it needs a little extra something to help pop out. I add that line in the crease where the leg meets the pant, you know, to help define that area a little better. So using lines sparingly to help me define areas and make it, you know, stick out a little better. And as you can see, I'm taking the white brush, which will bring the layer back, and I'm making it a smaller brush, that way I can carve in harsher shadows, see on that pant leg there, because I want a little bit of a harsher line there without it being so diffuse and so soft that it just blends into everything, you know? So I'm adding a bit more shadow here on the lapels to help kind of make them stand out from the shirt more, because at this point I didn't really want to add those lines in. I was trying to define these with shadows, and if I had kept working on this and maybe added another shadow layer, I could have made it work, but I felt like it was just easier to add in lines, so I ended up doing that later. But it just goes to show you can do really like tight, hard-edged shadows when you bring it in with that white brush. As long as you make it smaller on that mask layer, you can really add in really tightly defined shadows underneath areas to get that look. At this point I was kind of happy with where everything was, but I wanted to add another little layer of oomph to this because I really like that teal color. So I'm having a little fun doing something I don't normally do for the villagers. I added a new layer on top of the shadow layer, and I'm just going in, see on the left side, Tom Nook's right, but our left side of the face, I'm painting with that teal with the soft Bonobo chalk brush. I'm adding it kind of like a rim lighting, and I mess with the layer style. I think I changed it to overlay or something like that, but you can cycle through different layer styles to add a funky effect. I just wanted to add a little bit more teal to the very edge of the character in a really subtle way, but I want it to look like everything's kind of lit up with this nice islandy teal color, because I love the color so much and I want it to be a big part of all these pictures. So I'm just finding another way to incorporate it into the picture besides the background and the color of the leaves on the shirt, you know. The more teal the better. I just love this color. I think it's so pretty. So here I'm going in and playing around with layer styles. You can just open up the layer, tap the little letter that says N for normal, and you can just mess around with different layer styles. I think I changed it to like color or hue or something like that. But there's different effects you can get with screen, can add a nice bright touch depending on what colors you're using. Overlay can add like a hue of something. I don't know, you can just mess around with it. I don't know exactly what color science is going on under the hood, but I and everybody else I know just messes around with them until we find something that we like. So there's no rhyme or reason to it, you just gotta find what works. And here I'm finally deciding to add in the lines on the lapels because I feel like, yeah, they need them. I tried defining them just with the shadows, but they didn't stand out, you know, they needed something. And it helps it, you know, make the image a little bit better, I think, as well. It's like you need the right amount of lines, like not too many, not too few. And then it all kind of comes together, so I think these were definitely needed. One thing I like to do is I'm going in with the shadow layer again with a white paintbrush really small, just to get that really tight shadow right underneath the eyelid. It helps make his eyelids look a little heavier to give him that shadow, and it's also about where a shadow would be anyway, at the eyeball, so it makes it look a little bit more, I guess, realistic or more rendered, even though it's a really simple thing to do. You know, just add a little bit of a shadow to the eye. And then for Tom, I decided to give him a little bit of an eye shine. I don't do this for every villager because sometimes it just looks cuter if they just have solid black pupils with no glare or shine on them or whatever, but I like that kind of 3D look for Tom. I think it brings his eyes to life, you know? Thought it looked cute for him. And I just go in and I mess around with the shadows, making sure everything's right. Sometimes I'll fuss around with the picture way too much and, you know, I don't really need to, but for this one I wanted it to look really good because it's like the first of the New Horizons series, you know, so I wanted it to be kind of the mold for how I do all the other ones, so I wanted to make him extra good, you know? And here I just wanted to add another extra punch of teal. I couldn't get enough of that teal, so I thought adding a little bit of it to the inside of his pupils would be a nice touch too. It's like reflecting from that overwhelming teal sky or ocean or whatever kind of teal void surrounds him, you know? It's just another way to add that color in that I thought was really pretty. And I again used the Bonobo chalk brush because I like how soft it is there too. That was all on a new layer, and you can kind of paint and then erase just to make it a real subtle touch. I think I bring it down a little bit to make it less intense. And another little final touch I did was I added on a new layer just another layer of shadow underneath the head to help separate the head from the body, because the shadow layer itself wasn't doing enough to help make that distinction. It's little things like this that help, you know, tie the whole picture together. It's always like that last minute touch that, like, yeah, I need that, you know? And I think it does help his head, you know, look distinct from the rest of his body and gives him a little bit more dimension than it had prior to the shadow, so good little touches like this always help. And with that final touch, he is all finished. And here's the final Tom Nook after 44 or so minutes. It's not typical for these villagers to take quite this long, but this is more or less what I deal with for every villager, so now you guys have a real-time example of my drawing process beginning to end for all these villagers and see what kind of work I put into each of them. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see more real-time videos or more speed paint videos or anything else. Be sure to subscribe for more stuff like this, and thank you for watching.